The carriage hit a rut in the road, and Sonara Crane pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass, steadying herself. Outside, the moors rolled past in shades of gray and white, the first real snow of winter settling across the heath like a burial cloth. Across from her, Lord Aldrich Fenmore had not looked up from his correspondence in 40 minutes. She had counted. She had nothing else to do. "You don't have to do this," she said, quietly. "Ride with me, I mean. You could have sent a footman." He signed the bottom of a letter with the precise, unhurried stroke of a man who had never once acted in haste. "My sister asked me to see you safely to the crossroads. I honor my commitments." There it was. Honor. His single most exhausting virtue. "I'm perfectly capable of traveling alone. In November, on the northern moors." He folded the letter. "Certainly." Sonara turned back to the window. She had known Aldrich Fenmore for 4 years, long enough to understand that his silences were not empty, but deliberate, that his composure was armor rather than temperament, and that underneath the precise manners and the flat gray eyes was a man who had decided, long ago, that feeling things was an inefficiency he could not afford. Long enough, also, to have made a catastrophic mistake. Not a mistake she regretted. That was the honest truth she could not say aloud to anyone, perhaps not even to herself in daylight. What had happened between them had not felt like a mistake while it was happening. It had felt, with a clarity she had no precedent for, like the one true thing in a life full of carefully maintained performances. She had told herself that was enough, that stolen moments and unspoken understandings were sufficient for a woman in her position. She had been wrong. She was paying for it now, in the most permanent way imaginable. She pressed her fingers against her stomach. Just for a moment, just to remind herself it was real. 14 weeks. She had counted those too. She had been going to tell him. That was the cruelest part. Last night, standing in the corridor outside the library at Velmore Hall, she had rehearsed the words until they sat in her chest like stones, ready to be placed before him carefully, one at a time. She had told herself that whatever he said in return, she was prepared for it. She had believed it. Then she had heard his voice through the study door. Aldrich, his father's voice, low and settled. "The arrangement is confirmed. Lady Brielle Ashton will arrive before Christmas. I expect you to conduct yourself accordingly." And Aldrich's response, after a pause so brief it might have meant nothing at all. Of course. 2 words. That was all. Of course. As if he were confirming a dinner reservation rather than agreeing to marry another woman, while Sonara stood 14 weeks along with his child in a corridor 12 feet away. She had not knocked. She had not gone in. She had walked back to her room with her rehearsed words dissolving like paper in rain, and she had sat on the edge of the bed until her hands stopped shaking. That had been last night. This morning, she had accepted Lady Marin's suggestion that Aldrich could see her as far as the crossroads, because refusing would have required an explanation she did not have the strength to construct. A mistake, clearly. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm always quiet." "You're never quiet." He looked up then, and she made herself hold his gaze. Those gray eyes, steady and impenetrable, reading her face the way he read everything, as if it were a document that might contain useful information. "What's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. Sonara." She hated the way he said her name, not tenderly, precisely, like he was identifying something. "I'm tired," she said. "It was a long visit." He studied her a moment longer than was comfortable, then returned to his letters. "We'll be at the crossroads in 2 hours. You can rest on the post coach." 2 hours. She could endure 2 hours. Outside, the snow thickened. She watched it accumulate on the window ledge, watched the road ahead dissolve into white, and told herself she was composed. That she was fine. That she had made her decision already, in that corridor last night, and all she had to do now was execute it quietly and disappear before anyone understood what she was carrying away with her. Then the carriage lurched hard to the left. Sonara grabbed the door handle. Aldrich's letters scattered. The vehicle tilted at a wrong angle, wheels grinding against something that gave way beneath them, and they were stopped at a crooked angle in the middle of the road, with one wheel sunk to the axle in a ditch hidden beneath fresh snow. Aldrich was outside before she had fully registered that they had stopped. She heard him speaking to the coachman in clipped, controlled tones. She sat very still, one hand pressed to the door handle, and breathed. When he climbed back in, his jaw was tight. "The wheel is cracked," he said. "The axle may be damaged. We cannot continue until it's assessed." "How long?" "There is an inn a mile east. We'll shelter there while the coachman arranges repairs." Of course there was an inn. Of course there was a storm, and a broken wheel, and a mile of snow-covered road, and no possible exit from this carriage, or this situation, or the conversation she had not yet had. Of course there was. She almost laughed. "Fine," she said instead. She had said that word more in the past 12 hours than in the previous 12 months combined. Fine. Fine. A word that meant nothing and allowed everything to continue exactly as it was. She was becoming an expert in it. The walk to the inn was miserable. Snow fell in earnest, wind cutting across the open moor with a spitefulness that felt personal. Aldrich walked beside her, one hand at her elbow, to steady her on the icy ground, and she let him because refusing would have required explaining why she no longer wanted him touching her, and that explanation was a door she could not open. Not yet. The salted lantern was small, worn, and blessedly warm. A fire blazed in the common room hearth. The smell of wood smoke and roasting meat settled over Sonara, like a hand on the shoulder, and she stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The innkeeper was a broad woman, with a no-nonsense expression, who looked at them both, at the snow in their hair, and the mud on their boots, and the general air of two people who had not chosen to be in each other's company, and said, "1 room left, single bed, 3 shillings. Sonara felt Aldrich go still beside her. "That will suffice," he said. "It will not," Sonara said, at exactly the same moment. The innkeeper raised an eyebrow. "I've got a farmer from the valley who'll take it if you don't." Aldrich looked at Sonara. She looked at him. "1 moment," he said to the innkeeper, and guided Sonara 2 steps away by the elbow, lowering his voice. "There is no rational alternative. The storm is worsening. The road is impassable. You cannot sleep in the common room." "I can." "You will not." His eyes were flat and certain. "I'll take the floor. You'll take the bed. We'll leave at first light." She wanted to tell him she already had one secret she was carrying out of this county, and did not need to acquire another. She wanted to say that sharing a room with him was the last thing on this earth she was capable of managing tonight. She wanted to say a great many things. Instead, she said, "Fine." The room was at the top of a narrow staircase, barely large enough for the bed, a single chair, and a washstand pressed against the wall. A window faced the moor. The fire had been recently lit, and was only now beginning to take hold, casting more shadow than warmth. Sonara set her bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the fire and waited for the silence to either break or harden into something permanent. He removed his greatcoat and draped it over the chair and said nothing. She had been composed for 11 hours, 14 weeks, 4 years. She was not composed anymore. "I heard your father last night," she said. He turned. Through the study door. She kept her voice level. "The arrangement with Lady Brielle Ashton." Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt, not quite. "That conversation was private. I'm aware. I didn't intend to overhear it." She looked at her hands. "I was coming to find you. I had something to tell you." A pause that lasted exactly too long. "I didn't, in the end." "Sonara." "Don't." She stood. "Don't say my name like that. as if it's a problem you're calculating how to solve. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not making accusations. I simply thought you should know that I heard. And what exactly do you believe you heard? That you have agreed to marry her. The fire crackled. He was quiet for long enough that the quiet itself became an answer. It is the appropriate match, he said at last. She laughed. She hadn't meant to. It came out sharp and brittle and not remotely like laughter. The appropriate match. My father's health is failing. The family requires stability. Lady Brielle's connections are... I don't care about her connections. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that, at least. I care that 6 months ago you were... She stopped. Started again. I care that you allowed something to happen between us that you apparently never intended to mean anything. His jaw tightened. I never made you any promise. No, you didn't. She turned away from him, toward the window, toward the dark and the storm. You were very careful about that. What would you have had me promise? We come from entirely different circumstances. My obligations were always going to take precedence. You understood that. Did I? You should have. She closed her eyes. There were 14 words sitting at the back of her teeth. 14 words that would rearrange everything, that would make his composed face do something she had never seen it do, that would take this entire cold, careful exchange and turn it into something neither of them could walk away from cleanly. She could feel them pressing forward, insistent, impossible to ignore. He has a right to know. That was the argument she had been making to herself for 3 weeks. Whatever else was true, whatever he felt or did not feel, whatever arrangement his father had made with the Ashton family, he had a right to know about his own child. She swallowed them back down like stones. Tell me something, she said instead. Those months, whatever was between us, did it mean nothing to you at all? The silence stretched and stretched and stretched. I never loved you, he said. 4 words. Quiet. Even. Delivered like a door being closed from the inside. Sonara stood very still. Then she turned, picked up her bag from the floor, placed it beside the door, and lay down on the bed, fully dressed, facing the wall. Then there is nothing more to say, she said. Good night, my lord. She did not sleep for a single hour of the night. She woke at 4 in the morning to absolute silence. The storm had stopped. Through the frost-covered window, the sky had shifted from black to the deep blue-gray that comes in the hour before dawn, and the moor outside was still and white and undisturbed, as if the world had been remade clean overnight. Aldrich was asleep in the chair. His head rested against the high back at an angle that would make his neck ache for days. One hand lay open in his lap, completely relaxed in sleep, in a way it never was when he was awake. She had seen him sleep before. The openness of it had always undone her a little. She did not let it undo her now. She sat up carefully, slowly, the way she had learned to move these past weeks, now that her body was no longer entirely her own. She put on her boots without sound. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag and stood. At the door, she stopped. She turned and looked at him for a long moment. The way you look at something you are trying to memorize, without admitting to yourself why. The line of his jaw, the way exhaustion had softened the severity from his face, that open hand. She pressed her own hand to her stomach, just briefly, just once. Then she turned the handle, very quietly, and walked out. The stairs did not creak. The common room was empty and gray. She placed 3 shillings on the bar for her half of the room, pulled her coat tight against the pre-dawn cold, and walked out of the salted lantern into the white silence of the moor. She did not look back. Aldrich woke to stillness, not the stillness of a sleeping room, the specific stillness of a room that held only 1 person when it should have held 2. He registered it before he opened his eyes. Something in the quality of the air, the absence of another breath. He turned his head. The bed was empty, neatly smooth as if she had never been in it at all. Her bag was gone. Her coat was gone. The door stood slightly ajar, letting in a thin ribbon of cold from the corridor. He stood, walked to the window. Her footprints crossed the yard below in the fresh snow, small and deliberate, heading east toward the road, already half filled by the last of the overnight drift, already being erased. He stood at the window and looked at the place where she had been. Then, very quietly, as if he already knew no one would hear him, he said her name. The post coach to Harwick departed at 6 in the morning from the Crossroads Inn at Aldenmere, and Senara arrived with 4 minutes to spare, breathless and cold and profoundly grateful for both. She bought her ticket with money she had been saving since October. Not for this, not for any of this specifically. But she had understood, in some part of herself, she had refused to examine directly, that there might come a day when she would need to leave quickly, and she had prepared accordingly. She was her mother's daughter in that respect, at least. Practical, even when everything else was falling apart. The Aldenmere Inn was larger than the Salted Lantern, busier, a proper coaching stop with a full common room and a kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and something charred. She found a seat near the fire, ordered tea she could barely afford, and sat with her hands wrapped around the cup and told herself she wasn't shaking. She was, slightly. She focused on the fire, on the warmth of the cup against her palms, on the ordinary sounds of the room around her. A man arguing with the barkeep about a bill. 2 women in traveling clothes comparing notes on the road conditions north. A child running between the tables, while her mother called after her with exhausted patience. Normal things. Ordinary things. Evidence that the world continued moving, even when everything inside her had gone very quiet and very still. 14 weeks. 1 morning. 1 decision. She was doing the right thing. She was almost certain of it. Miss Crane. She looked up. The man standing before her was perhaps 30, well-dressed in traveling clothes, with the kind of unhurried ease that came from a lifetime of being received well wherever he appeared. Dark hair, a pleasant face, a smile that arrived slowly, as though it intended to stay. Phelan Dorset. She knew him from the Velmore summer gathering 3 years past, a neighbor of some distant connection to the Fenmore family, the sort of man who remembered everyone's name and made you feel, briefly, like the most interesting person in any room. She had always liked him in the uncomplicated way you like someone who has never given you a single reason not to. She had not expected to find him here. Mr. Dorset. She summoned what she hoped passed for a natural smile. What a surprise. Likewise. He looked at her bag, at her coat still damp from walking, at the tea she was gripping like something she might drown without. His expression sharpened slightly, though his tone remained easy. Traveling alone? To Harwick. My aunt is unwell. I'm sorry to hear it. He did not sit without being asked. She noticed that. I'm heading north myself. Family business. A pause. The post coach? Yes. As am I, as it happens. He glanced at the chair across from her, a question rather than an assumption. May I? She nodded. He sat, ordered coffee from the girl passing with a tray, settled into the chair with the relaxed ease of a man comfortable in any room, and did not immediately speak. He did not fill the silence with pleasantries, did not reach for the particular aggressive concern that some men deployed when they encountered a woman alone in a coaching inn at dawn. He simply sat, drank his coffee, and allowed her to decide what she wanted from the next few minutes. She found, faintly to her own surprise, that she did want something from them. You were at Velmore this past season, she said, briefly. September. He looked at her directly but without pressure. You were there as Lady Marin's companion. I was. He said nothing more, just waited. And now I'm here, she added, not entirely sure why. And now you're here, he agreed, with an inflection she could not quite read. Then, without warning, Are you all right, Miss Crane? The question was so plainly meant that she almost answered it honestly. Almost told him about a corridor and 2 words, and a hand pressed to her stomach in a cold room at 4 in the morning. "I'm perfectly well," she said, tired from the early start. "Of course." He accepted this without visible skepticism. Then, after a moment, "I drove past the Salted Lantern on the Harwick Road this morning, around 5 o'clock. I thought I saw someone walking alone on the moor in the dark." He lifted his coffee. "Probably mistaken." Sonara looked at him carefully. Phelan Dorset looked back with an expression that was pleasant and entirely unreadable. "If it had been someone you recognized," she said slowly, "what would you have done?" "Offered them a seat in my carriage," he said simply. It was barely above freezing, and the road had ice on it. She was quiet. "The post-coach is adequate," she said. "The post-coach," he replied, "is a wooden box with a draft from the left window and 6 strangers who will talk about the road conditions for the entire journey to Harwick." He said it without urgency, without leaning forward, without any of the pressure that would have made her refuse immediately. "My carriage has a brazier and a lap rug, and no one in it but my man Crew, who does not speak before noon, as a matter of personal principle. The offer stands if you want it. No conditions attached." Outside, the post-coach driver had begun calling the first boarding. Sonara looked at the door, then back at Phelan Dorset, with his quiet offer and his careful eyes, and the particular stillness of a man who was certain enough of himself not to push. She thought about Aldrich at the window of the Salted Lantern, whether he was standing there still, whether he had woken at all, whether the man who had said, "I never loved you" in that quiet, even voice had felt anything at all when he found the bed empty and her gone. "Thank you," she said. She stood and gathered her bag. "I'll take the post-coach." She walked to the door without looking back. She did not allow herself to wonder whether the expression on Phelan Dorset's face was relief or calculation, or something else entirely. She could not afford to find out. Not yet. The post-coach arrived at Harwick at 2:30 in the afternoon, and Sonara spent the first 20 minutes pretending she did not know what to do next. She had a plan. She had been building it in pieces for the past 3 weeks, adding details the way you furnish a room you hope never to need, the name of a solicitor in Edinburgh who owed her late father a favor, an aunt in the Scottish borders who had always had more sympathy than judgment, and a passage on a coastal packet from Whitby that departed on the first Thursday of each month. Today was Tuesday. She had 2 days. 2 days to reach Whitby. 2 days to disappear entirely. She was standing in the Harwick coaching yard trying to remember if Whitby was northeast or northwest when she heard his voice. "Miss Crane." She turned slowly, the way you turn when some part of you already knows. Aldrich Fenmore stood at the entrance to the yard. He was not in a carriage. He was on horseback, his gray coat dark with damp, his hair flattened by snow that had not fully stopped falling. The horse beside him was blowing hard, flanks heaving with the particular exhaustion of an animal pushed faster than it should have been, for longer than was wise. He had ridden, through the snow, through the dark, alone. She said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would not immediately give something away. "You left without waking me," he said. He dismounted and handed the reins to a yard boy without looking at him, his eyes fixed entirely on her face. "I left a note." "You did not leave a note." She had meant to. She had written 3 drafts of it in her head during the walk to Aldenmere. She could not now recall a single word of any of them. "Miss Crane." Phelan Dorset appeared at her elbow, with the uncanny timing she was beginning to suspect was entirely deliberate. He was carrying her bag, which she had set down when she turned, and apparently forgotten. He looked at Aldrich with a pleasantness that did not quite reach his eyes. "I don't believe we've met." Aldrich looked at him for precisely long enough to be uncomfortable. "We haven't." "Phelan Dorset, a friend of Miss Crane's from the Velmore gatherings." He offered his hand. "And you are?" a pause that lasted one beat too long. "Fenmore," Aldrich said, and shook it. Something shifted in Phelan's expression. Very slightly. He knew the name. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name. He looked between them with those dark, reading eyes, and did not say a single word about what he had clearly just understood. "I was about to see Miss Crane settled at the Harwick Arms," he said instead. "The road north is impassable until tomorrow. The storm has blocked the pass at Beckfield." He glanced at Aldrich's exhausted horse. "You look as though you could use a fire yourself." It was generous. It was also a test. Sonara could feel it. "Thank you," Aldrich said, in a tone that accepted the generosity and declined the test simultaneously. The Harwick Arms was everything the Salted Lantern had not been. Spacious, adequately staffed, with a dining room that served a proper supper, and enough guests that 3 people could sit at separate ends of it and maintain the polite fiction that they had all converged here entirely by coincidence. They did not sit at separate ends. Phelan, with a cheerfulness Sonara suspected concealed a great deal of tactical thinking, arranged for a table near the fire and made it entirely natural for all 3 of them to occupy it. He talked about the roads, about the storm, about a horse fair he had attended in September that had apparently been remarkable. He was very good at talking. He drew her into the conversation, drew responses from her she had not planned to give, and all the while she was acutely aware of Aldrich sitting directly across from them, eating in silence, watching, not watching Phelan, watching her. She became very focused on her food. It did not help. She could feel his attention with the same physical awareness she had always felt it, that particular quality of being the object of Aldrich Fenmore's full and undivided concentration. Most people, she had noticed over years of observation, found that concentration flattering. It was rare and complete, and made you feel, briefly, as though you were the most important thing in the room. She had long since stopped finding it flattering. She found it unbearable, because it saw too much and acknowledged too little, and because the gap between those 2 things was where everything painful lived. She had spent 4 years learning the grammar of Aldrich Fenmore's expressions, the slight contraction around the eyes that meant he was thinking hard, the quality of stillness that meant he was angry, the way he held a glass when he was working something through. She knew all of it. She knew it the way you know a language you were never supposed to learn. He was working something out right now. "The pass at Beckfield," she said, to Phelan, to anyone, to the general air. "How long will it remain blocked?" "Through tomorrow night, most likely." Phelan refilled her water glass with the quiet competence of a man who noticed things. "Perhaps into Thursday morning." Thursday morning. Her packet from Whitby departed Thursday morning. She set down her fork. "Is everything all right?" Phelan asked. "Fine," she said. That word again, her single most useful and most dishonest word. Across the table, Aldrich had gone very still. He was not watching her face anymore. He was watching her hands, the way the left one had moved, without her permission, to rest flat against her waist. She moved it away, but not quickly enough. She found him in the corridor outside her room at 9:30, standing with his back against the opposite wall, as though he had known she would have to walk past him eventually, and had simply decided to wait. "We need to speak," he said. "There is nothing to speak about. Sonara, stop saying my name like that." She had her key in her hand, and her bag over her shoulder, and approximately 9 hours until her last realistic chance of reaching Whitby in time, and she did not have the capacity for this conversation right now. "Whatever you came here to say can wait until morning. You will be gone by morning." She looked at him. He looked back, those gray eyes steady and unrelenting, reading her face with the precision that had always made her feel simultaneously seen and categorized, like a specimen, like a problem in need of solving. "Come inside," he said. Not a request. The room was cold. The fire had been lit only recently and was still finding itself. She set her bag down and stood at the window, the furthest point from him the room allowed, and crossed her arms. and waited. He stood near the door. He had changed out of the damp coat, and his shirt still held the cold of the ride in it. That chill that settles into fabric and takes hours to leave. He looked exhausted, she realized. Not in the polished way of a man who had had a long day, but in the deep, foundational way of someone running well below what they had available. She told herself it did not matter. "Where are you going?" he said. "My aunt is unwell. I told you. Your aunt in the Scottish borders has been in perfect health for 6 years. James Alderton saw her at a gathering in Edinburgh last month and wrote to say she looked better than she had in a decade." He paused. "I asked your brother before I left Velmore." She stared at him. "You spoke to Cormac?" "Briefly." His jaw was tight. He did not know where you had gone either. He was considerably less calm about it than I was. "Cormac." She closed her eyes. She had not written to Cormac yet. She had been going to do it from Whitby once she was safely on the water, and the decision was irrevocable. She had needed it to be irrevocable first. "I am leaving England," she said. The silence that followed was complete. She opened her eyes. He had not moved, not one visible muscle, but something had happened behind his expression, beneath the composed surface of it. Something that looked, for just a moment, like a man who had stepped onto ground that was no longer solid. "Why?" he said. One word. Very quiet. "Because I have reasons." She turned toward the window. "Because I have a life to build, and I cannot build it here anymore. Because staying is not possible." She stopped. The 14 words were there again. Right there, pressing against the back of her teeth. She swallowed them back. "I'm asking you to accept that. Because of what I said." She said nothing. "Sonara, if what I said last night is the reason, you said exactly what you meant." She turned back to face him, and she was proud, genuinely proud, of how level her voice remained. "That is the one thing I will not hold against you. You were honest. I would take honest cruelty over a kind lie every single time." She picked up her bag. "I have passage booked on a packet from Whitby to Leith. From Leith I will make my own arrangements. I am asking you not to tell Cormac until I have written to him myself." She moved toward the door. His hand closed around her wrist. Not hard, just certain. "Don't," he said. She looked at his hand, then at his face, and despite everything, despite 4 years and 14 weeks and 4 words that had hollowed her out like a struck bell, she felt exactly what she always felt when he was close to her. That impossible, devastating awareness that this was the person she had quietly organized herself around for longer than was sensible or safe. She pulled her wrist free gently. The way you remove something that should not be held, rather than something you want to escape. Then she walked out and closed the door. In her room, alone, with the door locked, and the fire finally beginning to offer something real, she sat on the edge of the bed and did what she had not allowed herself to do since the corridor outside the library at Velmore Hall. She pressed both hands to her stomach and she cried. Not composedly. Not quietly. The kind of crying that happens when you have carried something beyond the limit of what a person can carry, and your body simply refuses the task any further. She cried until there was nothing left. Then she washed her face with cold water, sat up straight, and told herself firmly that it was the last time. She was not entirely certain she believed it. She did not leave the next morning. This was not a decision so much as a fact that accumulated around her overnight, quietly and without announcement, until it was simply true. The pass at Beckfield remained blocked. The coastal road to Whitby was impassable until at least midday. Her packet departed at dawn on Thursday, and there was no route that could get her there in time, and the next sailing was a full week away. 1 week. She sat in the dining room of the Harwick Arms with a cup of tea she had been staring at for 20 minutes, and came to terms with the fact that she was not leaving today, and that somewhere in this inn, Aldrich Fenmore was also not leaving, and that the distance between those two facts was either very manageable or entirely impossible, depending on choices she had not yet made. Phelan appeared at 8:30, looking entirely too rested for someone who had spent the previous evening navigating a three-way conversation with the sustained tension of a chess match played in silence. "The pass is still closed," he confirmed, sitting down across from her without asking. He had stopped asking after the second day. She had stopped minding. "Through tomorrow, at the earliest, according to the innkeeper. Ice on the upper road." "I know." He poured himself coffee, looked at her with those careful dark eyes. "How are you?" "Fine. You have used that word in my hearing 5 times now, and it has meant something different on each occasion." He said it without reproach, simply as an observation. "I'm not going to ask what is wrong. I'm going to tell you that I have a sister in Edinburgh, with more rooms than she needs, and very little interest in other people's arrangements, and that if you needed somewhere to stay for a week or a month, I could see to it without anyone needing to know a single detail." Sonara looked at him for a long moment. Phelan Dorset was either entirely well-intentioned or exceptionally skilled at appearing so. She had not yet determined which, and the fact that she could not determine it told her more about her current state of mind than she was comfortable acknowledging. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because I watched you leave a coaching inn before dawn, with one bag and an expression I have seen on my sister's face." He said it simply, without drama. "And because I know what it looks like when a woman is carrying something, she should not have to carry alone." She wanted to ask what he thought he saw. She did not. "Thank you," she said. "I will consider it." He nodded and returned to his coffee, and did not press, and she was grateful for it in a way that made her feel faintly ashamed of how accustomed she had become to pressure being the default. She was still there, still staring at her tea, when Aldrich sat down across from her. Not beside Phelan. In the chair Phelan had vacated 15 minutes ago. He placed a cup of coffee in front of himself and said nothing, and looked at her with an expression that she could not fully read, which was unsettling in itself. She could always read him. "You are still here," she said. "The pass is closed. The Harrogate Road is clear. You could go south." "I am aware." "Then why are you sitting here?" The chair was unoccupied. She almost smiled. Almost. She caught it before it arrived. "What do you want, Aldrich?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, directly, "I want to know what you were going to tell me 2 nights ago, what you came to find me for, and why you changed your mind." "I told you everything I intended to." "No." He leaned forward slightly. "You told me you had come to find me, that you had something to say. Then you did not say it. I have been turning that over since yesterday morning, and I cannot make it resolve into anything coherent without knowing what it was. It no longer matters. It matters to me." "Aldrich!" "I rode 16 miles through a snowstorm before dawn," he said, very quietly. "Not because my father asked me to. Not because my obligations required it. Because I woke up and you were gone, and something in me that is not supposed to exist made waiting for daylight completely impossible." He looked at her steadily. "I do not behave that way. I have never behaved that way, and I think I am owed the courtesy of understanding what I rode 16 miles in the dark to understand." The dining room was warm and full, and nobody was paying them any attention whatsoever. She looked at her hands. The left one was in her lap. She was aware, with the precise and exhausting awareness that had shadowed her for weeks, of where it was resting. She moved it. He saw it. She knew because she felt the moment he did, the slight and particular quality of stillness that preceded him arriving at a conclusion. It was different from his thinking stillness. Deeper. More careful. She kept her eyes on the window. Snow was falling again beyond the glass, gentle and unhurried. Two sparrows were fighting over something on the ledge outside. Normal things. Ordinary things. Evidence that the world continued in its ordinary fashion, regardless of what was happening at a table by the fire inside the Harwick Arms. "How you look," he said, very quietly, almost to himself. "You look like someone who is exhausted and frightened and working very hard to appear neither." The dining room felt distant. The other guests, the fire, the ordinary sounds of the morning, all of it seemed to be happening on the other side of glass. Senara, the softest she had ever heard him say her name, as though the word itself might break. "Are you carrying my child?" The silence expanded. She looked at the window, at the snow, at the two sparrows quarreling over something small and urgent. She thought about 14 weeks, and a corridor, and a packet to Leith. She thought about the solicitor in Edinburgh, and her aunt, who was apparently in excellent health. She thought about what it meant to answer, and what it meant not to. She thought about 4 words said in a quiet, even voice in a cold room 2 nights ago. She thought about 16 miles ridden alone before dawn. She did not know how to hold both those things at once. She had been trying for 2 days, and she was not getting any better at it. She said nothing. He exhaled, slow and controlled, the breath of a man who had just received an answer without a single word being spoken. "How long?" he said. She said nothing. Senara. Not sharp, not demanding. Something she had no name for, because she had never heard this particular note from him before. "How long have you been carrying this alone?" The word alone landed differently than she had prepared for. She had anticipated anger, or the controlled problem-solving that was his default response to any situation requiring management. She had been bracing for that. She had not been bracing for the expression currently on his face, which was stripped of every layer she was used to seeing there, stripped back to something underneath that she had only glimpsed once before, briefly in a different season, and which she had spent months trying not to think about. His hands on the table were perfectly still, but she could see the effort that was costing him, the way you can see a current beneath still water. "You were coming to tell me," he said. "The night you heard my father." "Yes." "And you did not." "No." "Because you heard him first." He said it not as an accusation, but as a man placing pieces on a surface to see the shape they formed. "Because you heard the arrangement being confirmed, and you decided there was no longer any point in saying anything at all. It seemed unnecessary to complicate your arrangements." Unnecessary. The word came out with a quality she had not heard from him before. Not anger. Something beneath anger, more fundamental. "You were carrying my child, and you decided informing me was an unnecessary complication. From where I was standing, where you were standing, was a corridor outside my study, alone, with something that belonged to both of us, and you decided my convenience mattered more than the truth." He stopped himself, looked away briefly. When he looked back, his expression had been reassembled, but only partially, and underneath the composure, something was still unresolved, still moving. "That is not what I would have wanted. Whatever else is true, that is not what I would have wanted. You told me you never loved me. I know what I'd said. Then what would you have done?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "What exactly would you have done if I had knocked on that door and told you? Broken your father's arrangement? Chosen me over everything your family has spent 30 years building?" She shook her head. "I knew the answer before I asked the question. I was sparing us both." He was quiet for a long time. "You should have let me answer for myself," he said at last. "You had already answered." "That was not—" He stopped. His jaw worked. He looked at her with an expression she could not deflect and could not dismiss. Something raw and unguarded that she was not accustomed to seeing in his face and did not know what to do with. "3 years ago," he said. "The harvest gathering at Velmore. You were in the library. You had been reading something that amused you, and you looked up when I came in, and you had that look on your face, the one you get when something has genuinely delighted you, the one you cannot quite contain." He paused, looked at the table, then at her. I stood in the doorway and thought that I had never in my life wanted to be the reason someone looked like that. She stared at him. 3 years, he said. 3 years of telling myself it was nothing, that you were Cormac's sister and a guest in my family's house, and that whatever I was feeling was manageable and containable and would not affect anything that mattered. His voice was very low. I was wrong. I have been wrong about all of it for a very long time. And 2 nights ago I took everything I had failed to say and compressed it into 4 words and pointed them at you like a weapon because I was... He stopped. Because I was afraid of what I would say if I let myself say anything real. And instead of nothing, I said the worst possible thing. And you were already carrying this. Alone. The word again. Alone. She was not going to cry. She had already cried once, and she had told herself that was the last time, and she intended to keep that promise to herself. She pressed her palms flat on the table. She said nothing for a long moment after he finished. The dining room moved around them as it always had, indifferent and warm, full of people who had no idea that 2 people at a table by the fire were sitting in the wreckage of 3 years of silence and trying to work out if anything could be built from it. She had imagined, in the months when she had allowed herself to imagine things, that if he ever said something like this, she would know exactly what to feel. That it would be clean and simple, devastatingly clear in one direction or another. It was not clean, it was not simple. It was 3 years and 14 weeks, and 4 words, and 16 miles in the dark, all tangled together into something she did not have the vocabulary for. "What do you want me to do with that?" she asked quietly. "What am I supposed to do with all of that, when you are still the man your father is expecting to arrive in London next month with plans for a proper alliance and a suitable match? When nothing that is true between us changes any of the walls around us? I am asking you not to leave England." That is not an answer. I know. He held her gaze. "I'm asking you not to leave England while I work out how to give you one that is worthy of what you are carrying." She looked at the window, at the snow, at the sparrows, who had apparently resolved their dispute and were sitting side by side on the ledge in the cold, perfectly still. "Sonara," the quietest he had said her name yet. "Are you carrying my child?" The silence between them stretched until it was no longer silence, but something with weight and shape and presence. Something that pressed against the edges of the room and left no space for pretending. Aldrich sat very still across from her, his coffee cold and untouched, his hands flat on the table, and waited. She looked at the window for a very long time. She said nothing, and the nothing said everything. She was awake before the inn stirred. This was not unusual. Sleep had been unreliable for weeks, broken by a restlessness she could not reason away, by the particular alertness of a body that had decided it was responsible for 2 people now, and was taking that responsibility with great seriousness. She had learned to stop fighting it. She dressed in the dark and sat in the single chair by the cold window and watched the sky over the moor turn from black to gray to the thin, flat white of early winter morning, and she told herself she was thinking clearly. She was not entirely certain that was true. Phelan found her in the corridor at 7:30, before the dining room had properly opened, and while the inn was still making its slow and creaking way toward the day. He was carrying 2 cups of tea, which she found oddly touching. He held one out and she took it, and they stood in the corridor in companionable silence for a moment, the way people stand who have moved past the stage of needing to fill every gap with words. Then he reached inside his coat and produced an envelope. "I want to show you something," he said, "and I want you to let me explain it before you say anything." She took the envelope. Inside were 2 documents, travel arrangements, 2 passages on a mail coach from York to Edinburgh, departing in 4 days. Accommodation confirmed at an address in the new town. Both passages booked under assumed names she did not recognize. She looked at the date of booking. 4 days ago, before she had left Velmore, before she had arrived at Aldenmere, before she had taken the post coach to Harwick and found him at the coaching inn with his careful eyes and his unhurried manner. "You booked these before you met me at Aldenmere," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Phelan. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was at Velmore 3 weeks ago. I came to call on Lady Marin about a matter of shared business. I arrived early. I was shown to the drawing room to wait, and I heard a conversation I was not supposed to hear." He met her eyes directly. "Between Lord Fenmore and his father, about the arrangement with the Ashton family, and about you." The corridor was very quiet. "About me," she repeated. His father was telling him that any attachment of a personal nature needed to be resolved before Lady Brielle arrived. He said it carefully, without embellishment. The word he used was resolved, as though you were a complication to be managed rather than a person. Something moved in his expression. "I left before I was announced. I told Lady Marin I would call another day, and then I thought about what I had heard for 3 weeks and could not stop thinking about it." She stared at the documents in her hand. "You do not know me well enough to do this," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "But I know what I heard. And I know what resolved means when it is said in that tone by a man like that." He nodded at the envelope. "The offer stands. No conditions, no obligations. Edinburgh, 4 days from now, or never. Entirely your choice." She folded the documents back into the envelope, held it, said nothing, and did not notice the figure who had emerged from the staircase at the end of the corridor and had stopped very still, watching them. She was still standing there, envelope in hand, when she turned and found Aldrich in the corridor. He was looking at the envelope with the particular expression she had come to know as the controlled surface of something entirely uncontrolled underneath. His eyes moved from it to Phelan, who held his gaze with a steadiness that acknowledged everything and conceded nothing. "Mr. Dorset," Aldrich said, "would you excuse us?" It was not a question. Phelan looked at Sonara. She gave the smallest nod. He took his tea and walked back toward the staircase and did not hurry, which she suspected was a deliberate communication directed at Aldrich. Then it was just the two of them. "Those are travel documents," Aldrich said. "Yes." "He booked passage for you to Edinburgh. He booked passage for 2 people. He's not compelling me to use it." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. She could see him choosing his words the way he always chose them, with precision, discarding the ones that would cost too much or reveal too much or push the conversation in a direction he was not yet ready to go. She was done waiting for him to arrange himself. "You told me you never loved me," she said. "So tell me something. What exactly did you come here to take back?" He stopped. She watched it land, watched the precise way the question arrested him, suspended him somewhere between the sentence he had been about to form and the one she had just forced into existence. "Sonara, what did you ride 16 miles through the dark to reclaim? Because if the answer is the arrangement, if this is about your father and the family obligations and managing the situation before it becomes a scandal, then tell me that clearly, and I will make my own decision about Edinburgh. But if it is something else," her voice held barely, "then I need you to say it. Not imply it. Not circle it from a careful distance. Say it." He looked at her for a long time. He opened his mouth. She turned and walked down the corridor and pushed through the door to the dining room before he could form the first word. And she sat down at the nearest table and pressed her hands flat on the surface and breathed and told herself it was cold. Cormac Crane arrived at the Harwick Arms at noon, and Sonara heard him before she saw him. His voice carried from the coaching yard through the window of the dining room where she was sitting, loud and unmistakably her brother, demanding of the yard boy whether a woman of this description had come through in the last 2 days. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. He was in the doorway when she reached the entrance hall, mud on his boots, exhaustion carved into the lines of his face, hair disordered from what had clearly been a very hard 2 days of riding. He saw her, and the relief that crossed his face was so unguarded and so complete that she felt something give way in her chest. "Senara!" He crossed the hall and pulled her into a fierce hug that said considerably more than her name, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed and allowed herself, for just a moment, to be the younger sibling and not the person who had everything under control. She did not, objectively, have everything under control. "I'm all right," she said against his coat. "You left without telling anyone where you were going." His arms tightened. "You left a note that said nothing except that you needed time and you would write when you were settled. That is not a note, Senara. That is a threat. I'm sorry. You will be." He pulled back and looked at her face, the way her father used to when she was young and had fallen off something, and he was trying to establish the extent of the damage. "What happened? Was it something at Velmore? Lady Marin said you seemed yourself when you left. But Aldrich—" He stopped. His expression changed. Over her shoulder he had apparently found something. She turned. Aldrich was standing in the doorway to the corridor, still as a pillar, watching her brother, the way a man watches a situation he already knows is about to become more complicated. Cormac's hands released her shoulders slowly. "Fenmore," he said. The warmth was entirely gone. "Crane." Aldrich inclined his head. "Why are you here?" "He followed me," Senara said quickly. "The carriage broke down on the moor road. We took shelter at the Salted Lantern, and then the roads were blocked. He found me at Aldenmere and followed me here." Cormac looked between them with the expression of a man rapidly performing calculations he did not want to be performing. He knew Aldrich. They had not been close, not the way Aldrich and some of the county men were close, but they had been in each other's company enough times that Cormac understood the general dimensions of his character. He was not, Senara knew, a stupid man. "I see," he said, which meant that he saw considerably more than the surface of what she had described. "Perhaps," Aldrich said quietly, "we should speak privately." "Perhaps we should," Cormac agreed, and the pleasantness in his voice had the temperature of standing water in January. They went to the small sitting room off the entrance hall. Senara followed, and neither of them told her not to. Cormac sat. Aldrich stood. Senara stood by the window and looked at the yard outside and let her brother ask the first question. "The arrangement with the Ashton family," Cormac said. "I heard 2 weeks ago that it had been quietly broken off. I did not connect it to anything at the time. I am connecting it now." He looked at Aldrich directly. "Was my sister the reason?" Aldrich did not look away. "Yes." Cormac was quiet for a moment. "How long?" "Longer than was appropriate. I handled it badly from the beginning, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." "No," Cormac said, with a precision that was almost admiring. "You are not going to pretend otherwise with me." He sat forward. "I am going to tell you what I know, and I am going to ask you something, and I need a plain answer from you. Not a managed answer. Not an answer that protects your family's interests, or your father's arrangements, or your own considerable reputation. A plain one." Aldrich held his gaze without flinching. "All right. I know the Ashton arrangement is broken. I know you broke it. I know my sister left Velmore before dawn on a November morning carrying one bag. And I know you followed her on horseback through a snowstorm, alone, without a footman or a message, or any indication that you were coming." He paused. "And I know that you have been in my family's orbit for 4 years, and that during those 4 years, there have been moments, several of them, that I catalogued and set aside because you were always perfectly correct in your behavior, and there was nothing I could point to and say that is wrong. But I knew. Brothers generally do. He looked at Aldrich steadily. What are your intentions toward my sister? Sonara turned from the window. Aldrich looked at her, not at Cormac, when he answered. To marry her, he said, if she will have me, and to spend whatever time it takes between now and that moment, persuading her that I am worth the considerable inconvenience. The room was very quiet. Cormac looked at his sister. She looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at her with an expression that held no performance in it at all, nothing calculated or managed or carefully arranged. He simply looked at her, and the looking said the thing he had not yet found the words to say, and she felt it land in the center of her chest like something returning from a long way away. There is something else, she said. Her voice was steady. Something Cormac needs to know. Something that changes the nature of this conversation considerably. Her brother's eyes moved to her slowly. I'm going to tell him, she said, to Aldrich, to herself, to the room in general. And I'm going to tell you properly. Later. Privately. But Cormac needs to know first. Aldrich nodded. Once. Quietly. She turned to her brother. Let him leave us for a moment, she said. And then, sit down. After Aldrich had gone and the door had clicked shut, she sat across from Cormac and looked at her hands and said, I need you to listen to everything before you say anything. Can you do that? Cormac, to his considerable credit, said yes. She told him. She told him everything. The library in October, the corridor, and the words she had heard through the study door, and the words she had not been able to say after them. The salted lantern, the walk to Aldenmere, the post coach, Phelan and his travel documents, and his sister in Edinburgh, and the offer she had not quite accepted, or refused. 14 weeks and what 14 weeks meant. She told him all of it while looking at her hands because she could not look at his face while the telling was happening. He listened to the entire thing without interrupting, which she suspected cost him more than almost anything he had ever done, and when she finished, the room was very quiet for a long time. How long have you known? He said at last. Since October. He closed his eyes, opened them. And you were going to Edinburgh. To Edinburgh. And then wherever seemed appropriate after that. Without telling me. I was going to write. Sonara. His voice broke slightly on the second syllable of her name, and she had to look at the window again. I wrote to Father before I left. I told him you were gone, and I had gone to find you. I told him you had been at Velmore, and that Aldrich Fenmore's name had come up in connection with your leaving. He paused. He will draw conclusions. He may already be on his way. She pressed her eyes shut. Of course he was. Does Father know about the Ashton arrangement being broken? She asked. He will by now. 2 counties have been discussing it for a week. She opened her eyes. Outside the window, the coaching yard went about its ordinary business, entirely indifferent to the fact that everything had arrived at a point of no return at once. Are you angry with me? She asked. Cormac was quiet for a moment. I am angry that you were alone with it, he said finally. I am angry that you thought you had to be. That is the entirety of what I am angry about. He paused. Everything else I can work with. She looked at him. Everything else I can work with, he repeated, and she believed him. Then there is nothing to manage quietly, she said. No, Cormac agreed. There is only what comes next. He looked at her steadily. Which means you need to stop planning your exit and start deciding what you actually want. Not what is manageable. Not what protects everyone from the difficult conversation. What you want. He let that sit for a moment. Because you have been making plans for other people's comfort for long enough, and it has not, as far as I can observe, made you particularly happy. She looked at her brother. "No," she said quietly. "It is not." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the coaching yard moved through its ordinary business without concern for any of it. "He said he wants to marry me," she said. "I know what he said." "You don't trust it." Cormac looked at her with the particular expression he had reserved, since they were children, for situations where he was choosing honesty over comfort. "I trust that he said it in the heat of the moment, in a room where he felt the weight of what he had done. I do not yet trust that he will say it in the cold light of what it costs him." He paused. "But I am willing to find out." She had been walking toward the garden for 10 minutes before she understood that she had made a decision. She had not made the decision consciously. It had assembled itself below deliberation, in that part of her that had been resolving things without her supervision for weeks. The time for managing distance was over. Whatever came after this conversation, she was not leaving without saying the words out loud. She found him in the small garden behind the inn, where someone had made a half-hearted attempt at winter pruning before abandoning it to the weather. He was standing with his back to the door, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the moor in the middle distance, with the expression of a man conducting an internal argument he had been losing for some time. He heard her and turned. She did not allow herself to rehearse it. She had been rehearsing things for 14 weeks, and it had accomplished nothing useful, and she was finished with it. "I'm carrying your child," she said. 14 weeks. I have known since October. I was coming to tell you the night I heard your father, and I did not. And I should have, regardless of what I overheard. And I am sorry for that." She stopped. He looked at her. The look on his face was not what she had been bracing for. She had expected the stillness that preceded calculation. She had expected to watch him begin to arrange things in his mind, assessing implications, mapping consequences, building a plan in the precise and bloodless way he built all plans. Instead, he looked like a man who had just been handed something he was not certain he was permitted to hold. He said nothing for a long time. Then, very quietly, "What do you want?" She stared at him. "Not. What are we going to do?" "Not. How do we manage this?" "Not. My father needs to know, or the situation requires resolution, or any of the 100 controlled and responsible things she had been anticipating from him. What do you want?" She opened her mouth, and found that she did not have an answer ready, because she had spent 14 weeks thinking about everything except that question, had spent 14 weeks managing and arranging and preparing to disappear, and the simple directness of it had cut through all of that, and left her standing in a cold winter garden with no prepared response at all. She closed her mouth. He waited. The silence stretched between them, and this time it was hers, and he bore it without pressing, without filling it, without doing anything except looking at her, with that expression she still did not have a name for. She turned and walked back inside before she said something she was not yet ready to say. She was at the door when he spoke again. "I want you to know," he said, very quietly to her back, "that whatever your answer is, I am not going anywhere. I am not managing this from a distance. I am not sending arrangements ahead of me and following up with polite letters." A pause. "I am here. In this specific garden, in this specific inn, in the middle of November, and I intend to remain until you have an answer for me." She stood at the door for a moment. Then she went inside. She heard him exhale behind her, soft and careful, in the cold air of the garden. The Duke of Velmore arrived at the Harwick Arms the following morning. Senara knew he was coming before the carriage appeared in the coaching yard, because Aldrich had gone very still at breakfast in the particular way that meant he had seen or heard something from the window behind her, and because that quality of stillness was different from his usual kind. More braced, more foundational, as though he were pressing something down that had been building pressure for a long time, and had selected this morning to require all of his attention at once. She had watched him across the breakfast table for the past 2 days. She had watched him speak with Cormac in the corridor, with the particular honesty of a man who has nothing left to protect by being evasive. She had watched him read the letter from his father's solicitor that arrived on the second morning, and set it down with an expression that was not fear and not resignation, but something quieter and more resolved than either. The expression of a person who has made a decision and is at peace with what it costs. She had not told him that yet, that she had seen it, that it had changed something. She turned. The carriage in the yard bore the Fenmore crest on its door. The Duke was a tall man, older than she had imagined from Aldrich's descriptions of him, which had been sparse and precise and stripped of feeling in the way that descriptions of painful things often are. He moved through the inn's entrance hall with the automatic authority of a man who had never once in his life been required to wait, and he looked around the common room with an expression that managed to be simultaneously composed and deeply, architecturally displeased. His eyes found Aldrich first. Then they found her. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to establish that she wasn't going to be the one to look away first. And then she looked at Aldrich, and Aldrich was already standing. They went to the sitting room again. All of them, this time. Aldrich, his father, Sonara, Cormac, who had positioned himself near the door with the crossed arms of a man prepared to remain until something was resolved. Phelan, to his credit, had vanished discreetly somewhere and had not reappeared. The Duke looked at his son for a long moment. "You ended the arrangement," he said, "without consulting me, without a word of warning to the Ashton family, without—" "Yes," Aldrich said, "you understand what that cost, what it continues to cost. Alderton has written to 3 families already. The Hargroves will not—" "I understand," Aldrich said. "I am aware of every consequence. I have thought of little else for a week." His father looked at him with an expression Sonara could not read. "Then explain to me," he said, with the cold precision of a man building a case, "what you intend to offer this family that justifies the damage you have already done to ours." Silence. Aldrich looked at his father for a long moment. Then he looked at Sonara. She said nothing. She had told herself she would not intervene. This was his, and his alone. And if she spoke for him, or rescued him, or made it easier in any way, then neither of them would ever know if what he said was what he meant, or what the situation required. She looked at him steadily. "Choose," she had said to him in the corridor, in the garden, in the dining room, in every look she had given him for the past 3 days. "Not for duty, not for the family, for yourself." He looked back at her. Then he looked at his father. "She is carrying my child," he said. "She has been carrying it for 14 weeks, alone, because I said something to her that was neither true nor kind, and she believed it, and made arrangements to leave England, rather than tell me." He paused. The room was absolutely still. "That is what I have done. That is the full account of it. And I am telling you now, rather than finding a quieter arrangement, because she deserves better than a quieter arrangement, and because I am finished conducting myself in a way that requires everything to be managed from a distance." He could hear the Duke breathing, could see the precise and careful way his father was holding himself together in the face of something he had not, for once, anticipated. "I have spent my life," Aldrich continued, and his voice was entirely steady, "doing what the family required, not because I was forced to, because I believed in it. I believed that duty and restraint and correct conduct were sufficient substitutes for the things that duty and restraint required me to set aside. I believed that, if I was disciplined enough, for long enough, the rest of it would stop mattering." He paused. "I was wrong. I have been wrong about that for 3 years, and the cost of being wrong was not paid by me, it was paid by her, and I am not willing to extend that arrangement for a single further day." The Duke was very still. She had nothing to offer your family's position, Aldrich said. No title, no alliance, no strategic advantage of any kind. She has extraordinary intelligence and remarkable courage, and she walked alone through a dark moor at 4 a.m. rather than stay somewhere she felt unwanted. And she has been managing a 14-week secret with a composure that puts every person in this room to shame. His voice dropped slightly. Those are not things I am willing to trade for an alliance with anyone. I tried. I could not do it. I am not going to try again. He looked at his father directly. I'm going to marry her, Aldrich said. I am asking for your blessing because I have not stopped respecting you, not even now, not even after everything. But I am not asking for your permission. His father was silent for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its cold precision. Not all of it, but some. She has no title, he said. No alliance to bring. No connections that benefit the family's position. No, Aldrich agreed. You understand that this is not how the thing is done. I understand that perfectly. Another long silence. The Duke looked at Sonara. She met his eyes without flinching, not because she was unafraid, but because she had run out of things to be afraid of, and it turned out that once you reached that point, everything became considerably clearer. She has your eyes, he said to Aldrich. It was not what she had expected him to say. The same way of looking at a room as if it owes her an explanation. Aldrich said nothing. Your mother looked at me like that, the Duke said very quietly. 31 years ago. I told her it was inconvenient. He was quiet for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, or perhaps at something only he could see. I spent 30 years being grateful I reconsidered. Do not give yourself the same 30 years to regret. He looked at his son. Something had shifted in his face, something that took years off it, and made him look, briefly, like a man who was choosing honesty over duty for perhaps the first time in a long time. Don't repeat my mistakes, he said. The room was silent for a moment. Not the silence of an argument paused, or a negotiation at an impasse. Something different. The silence of a room in which several people had just, simultaneously, said more of the truth than they were accustomed to saying, and were adjusting to the altered air of it. Sonara looked at Aldrich. He was looking at his father with an expression she had never seen on his face in the entire 4 years she had known him. It was not relief, not triumph. It was something gentler than both. Something that looked, quietly and without performance, like a man who had just put down a weight he had been carrying for a very long time, and was not certain yet what his hands were supposed to do without it. She crossed the room and stood beside him without taking his hand, simply present, and the look that passed between them was so plain and complete that Cormac, watching from the doorway, looked away. Then the Duke stood, straightened his coat, and looked at Cormac Crane by the door. I believe, he said, that a conversation with the young woman's father is required. I will write to Edwin Crane this afternoon. Cormac looked at his sister. She looked back at him. I'll write too, Cormac said. It will go better if it comes from both of us. They were married in the spring, in the small church at the edge of the Velmore estate that had served the family for 200 years. It wasn't the wedding the Duke had originally envisioned for his son. There were no grand processionals, no 100-name guest lists, no strategic placement of important families in the front pews. There was the church, and the spring light coming through old glass, and the smell of something flowering outside that drifted in through the open door. There was Cormac, standing with their father in the second row, Edwin Crane, who had traveled up from the south with considerably less resistance than anyone had expected, having apparently decided sometime between Cormac's letter and his arrival at Velmore that a man who abandoned every obligation and followed her alone through a winter storm before dawn was the kind of man worth taking seriously. There was Lady Marin, who wept so freely throughout the ceremony that she required 2 handkerchiefs and borrowed a third from Phelan Dorset, who stood 2 rows behind her and seemed genuinely pleased, in the uncomplicated way of a man who had helped and then gracefully stepped aside and required nothing for it. There was the Duke of Velmore in the front row, who did not weep and did not smile, and looked at the altar with an expression that Senara, watching him from the doorway before she walked in, decided was as close to peace as that particular face was built to achieve. And there was Aldrich, at the altar, who turned when she appeared in the doorway, and looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging and naming for 4 years, every small variation of it, and saw in it something she had never seen there before, something that had no calculation in it, and no management and no careful distance, something that was simply and completely him. Looking at her, the way she had looked at him, she now understood, for longer than she had ever admitted to herself. She walked toward him and did not look away. The ceremony was brief, and the vows were old, and she said yes when she was asked, and he said yes when he was asked, and the spring light moved across the stone floor, and it was, she thought, exactly the right amount of simplicity for something that had been complicated for such a long time. The scandal, such as it was, lasted approximately 6 weeks, and then subsided under the combined weight of the Duke's public endorsement, Cormac Crane's well-regarded reputation in 2 counties, and the general consensus, arrived at gradually and without announcement, that a man who abandons a strategic alliance and rides alone through a snowstorm for a woman he loves is perhaps not the correct target for society's sustained disapproval. Phelan Dorset attended the wedding. He brought a bottle of something old and expensive from his family's cellar and shook Aldrich's hand at the door of the church with the straightforward warmth of a man who is genuinely pleased about an outcome he played no small part in creating. Aldrich thanked him with equal straightforwardness, and they understood each other completely and never needed to discuss it further. Myron was born in May at Velmore Hall in the long afternoon light of a late spring day, still golden but softening, unhurried. She arrived into the world with the determined expression of a person who had strong opinions about being here and intended to make them known. And she had her father's gray eyes and her mother's way of looking at a room as though it owed her a full account of itself. Aldrich sat beside the bed and held her for a very long time and did not speak. Senara watched him. She had spent 4 years cataloging his expressions. She did not have a name for this one. It was new. It was something she had not seen before, on his face or anyone else's, and she found that she had no desire to name it, only to observe it and remember it and keep it. He looked up eventually and found her watching him. "She is extraordinary," he said. "She has been here for 20 minutes. 20 minutes is sufficient time to form a clear assessment." He looked back down at Myron, who was regarding him with the same considered attention he was giving her. "She looks skeptical." "She looks like you." "She looks skeptical," he repeated. But the corner of his mouth had moved in a way she recognized, and she felt something warm and settled move through her chest. 5 months after that, on an evening in October, when the moor outside the windows had gone copper and amber, and the fire had been lit for the first time since spring, Aldrich came to find her in the library. She was in the chair by the window. He sat in the one across from her, with the ease of a man who had been sitting in that chair regularly, and had come to think of it as his, which it had become, more or less, since they had arrived at Velmore in June. He looked at her for a moment in the firelight. "Do you remember what I said to you in the carriage?" he asked. She looked at him. "In November, on the moor road." His voice was quiet and direct, the way his voice had been, she realized, since the Harwick Arms, since he had stopped using it to manage distance between them. "What I said when you asked if it had meant anything." "I remember," she said. "I need you to know," he said, "that it was the single most dishonest thing I have ever said. And I have spent a year trying to understand why I said it. And the only answer I have arrived at is that I was standing in a cold room with the person I loved most in the world. And the truth of that was so much larger than anything I knew how to hold that I took it and I compressed it into the worst possible version of itself and aimed it at you like it was a weapon. The fire moved. Outside, the moor was going dark. "I know," she said softly. "I know you know." He leaned forward slightly. "I need you to hear me say it anyway, because you asked me once, in a corridor in an inn, what I had come to take back, and I did not answer you." He looked at her steadily. "I came to take back 4 words. I came to take back the year you spent believing them. I came to take back every morning you woke up alone with that secret, and every night you went to sleep with it, and every mile between Velmore and Oldenmere that you walked in the dark because of something I said." She said nothing. Her throat was too full for words. "I have loved you," he said, "since before I was honest enough to know it. Since a library and a laugh and the look on your face when something delights you. Since long before I deserved to. And I intend to spend whatever I have left of my life making that the loudest and most frequently demonstrated truth in your immediate vicinity." He paused. "Starting now, if you are amenable." She looked at him across the fire-lit room, the man who had said, "I never loved you," in a cold voice, in a cold room, on a November night that felt like a very long time ago. The man who had ridden 16 miles alone through a snowstorm before dawn. The man who had stood in front of his father and said the thing that cost him everything and chosen it anyway. "I am amenable," she said. He smiled. The full, rare, warm one that she had been keeping a private inventory of since the Harwick Arms, adding to it each time it appeared, which was more often now than it had ever been. She crossed the room, and he stood to meet her, and they stood together in the firelight of the Velmore Library, while Myron slept upstairs, and the moor went dark outside, and the October wind moved across the heath the way it always had, and always would, indifferent and patient, and carrying nothing but the smell of cold grass and distance. It was, she thought, exactly enough. It was, she thought, everything. She had spent a long time in the months after the Salted Lantern, and the Harwick Arms, and the spring wedding, and the August birth, trying to identify the moment when she had known for certain. The moment when she had understood that what was between them was not going to be managed into nothing, not by his father or his obligations, or his own considerable talent for compression. The moment she had known it would survive. She thought it might have been the corridor at the Harwick Arms when she asked what he had come to take back and walked away before he could answer, and felt for the first time in 4 years the particular sensation of being the one who knew what she wanted. Or perhaps it had always been there, underneath everything, waiting for both of them to run out of things to hide behind. It did not matter. What mattered was the library and the fire, and Myron asleep upstairs, and the man across from her who was looking at her with the expression she had stopped trying to name. If Sonara and Aldrich's story moved something in you, you are not alone. This is a story about the things we say when we are afraid, and the things we do when we finally stop being afraid. About the difference between what duty asks of us and what love requires, about the courage it takes to choose something real over something safe, and to keep choosing it even when the cost is high, even when the world says you should know better, even when the only reason left is that it is true. If this is the kind of story you come back for, the subscribe button is below. And if there is someone in your life who needs to hear a story about a second chance, share this with them. There are more stories where this one came from. Stories about impossible choices and the people who found the courage to make them anyway. About the things we say in the dark when we are afraid, and the things we do in the light when we finally stop being. About the distance between I never loved you and I have loved you since before I was honest enough to know it, and everything that has to happen before a person can travel from one to the other. We will be here when you are ready for the next one.